Have you ever been punished not for failing, but for succeeding too well? 12 minutes before I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the International Leadership Forum in Florence, an email popped up on my phone. The subject line was simple, cold, and clinical. People like you are a liability. No greeting, no context. Just those 6 words, followed by a formal termination letter signed by Brian Lockhart, CEO of Catalyst Edge. No meeting, no phone call, no explanation. I had just been fired while standing backstage at the most prestigious business conference of the year. Outside the curtain, 3,000 executives from across the world waited to hear me speak about innovation in global markets, a speech that, ironically, had been requested by our own board just weeks earlier. But the man in the front row was the one who would change everything. His name was Victor Kwan. He wasn't just an attendee, he was the executive chairman of the multinational SU holding group that owned Catalyst Edge. Brian Lockhart, in his arrogance, had forgotten one small detail. Sometimes when you try to bury someone in the dark, you don't realize they're actually taking root. I didn't set out to build an empire. When I joined Catalyst Edge 7 years ago, it was a modest regional firm with shaky global ambitions and no real foothold beyond North America. I was 31, driven and foolishly optimistic, traits that would become both my greatest assets and later my greatest vulnerabilities. My role was Director of International Strategy, which sounded impressive on paper, but in truth meant starting from scratch. There were no European clients, no localized playbooks, and not even a functioning CRM that tracked international leads. The company's idea of going global was translating its website into French and German and hoping for the best. But I saw potential, untapped markets, misread cultural nuances, and clients hungry for tailored solutions. I began with late-night calls to prospects in Berlin and Brussels, slowly building relationships that required more listening than selling. I flew coach across continents, attended second-tier conferences on my own dime, and made promises I wasn't sure I could keep, because no one else at the company even knew what we were trying to do. In Tokyo, I sat through 7 hours of formal meetings without once speaking out of turn. In Amsterdam, I negotiated a licensing deal while fighting off the flu. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, even my father's funeral, because Brian Lockhart insisted the Tokyo pitch couldn't wait. He sent flowers, of course, with a short note. "Appreciate your dedication." I framed that note once. For a while, I actually believed he meant it. Year by year, the European and Asian divisions began to take shape. I recruited local partners, hired multilingual staff, and established regional offices in Munich, Singapore, and Copenhagen. Our global business revenue climbed from $2 million to over $50 million annually by year 6. Clients trusted me because I took the time to understand how they worked. I didn't treat them as numbers or checkboxes in a quarterly report. I showed up in person. I learned their languages, French, German, and enough Japanese to navigate a boardroom without an interpreter. When our Munich partner firm faced a PR disaster, I spent 3 straight days helping them manage the fallout, even though it had nothing to do with us directly. They remembered that, and they stayed loyal. Internally, things were more complicated. With every win I brought in, Brian's public praise grew thinner, his emails colder. In board meetings, he began referring to the European growth as team effort, rarely acknowledging my name. At the start, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He was the CEO, after all, and I wasn't in this for the spotlight. But there was a shift, subtle at first, then obvious. My projects were rebranded as executive initiatives. My proposals were cleaned up and presented by others. Once, I sat through a strategy presentation that was lifted word for word from a private memo I'd written. No credit, not even a passing mention. Still, I kept going, because I believed in the work, because I thought eventually merit would speak louder than politics. Brian had hinted several times at a seat on the executive committee. He used words like equity consideration, succession planning, and long-term leadership vision. I stayed up preparing late-night decks. I flew to Zurich with 48 hours' notice. I accepted every last-minute meeting. And when I was offered speaking slots at international conferences, I always asked his permission first, even when I didn't need it. So when the Florence keynote came through, I thought this was it. The recognition I had quietly worked toward. For almost a decade, I had no idea that the very event meant to celebrate our global progress would be the one Brian used to erase me. At least, that's what he intended. What he didn't know was that Florence would become the stage not for my humiliation, but for his reckoning. The signs were there, of course, if I'd been willing to see them. A year before Florence, things had already started to shift beneath my feet. It began with small omissions, being left off calendar invites to meetings I'd usually lead, finding out about client updates secondhand, or being asked to just sit in and observe during strategy calls I had once been trusted to run. When I brought it up with Brian, he brushed it off with a tight smile and a line I'd hear more than once. "You're too valuable to be bogged down with day-to-day." At the time, I took it as a compliment. Now I know better. The real turning point came when Brian introduced someone new, Chad Morton, his brother-in-law, as the Director of International Operations. The title was manufactured, the experience thin. Chad had spent the last 4 years running a regional sales team for a car rental chain in Ohio. He spoke no foreign languages. His passport, I later learned, had been issued just 2 months before he started, but Brian sold him to the executive team as the answer to our global integration challenge. I was blindsided. Chad's role overlapped directly with mine, but no one had consulted me. Worse, he was given access to all of my accounts and started joining my client meetings uninvited. His insights were shallow, his tone arrogant, and his follow-through non-existent. One German client, after a particularly tone-deaf video call, emailed me privately. "Is this person permanent? We're concerned about future communications." I forwarded the message to Brian. He didn't respond. It wasn't just Chad. Brian began quietly removing layers of my influence. My direct reports were reassigned. Client strategy documents I had authored were streamlined by Brian's team, meaning stripped of their nuance and plastered with corporate jargon. 1 month, a dozen of my active client relationships were redirected through a new internal account ownership model, supposedly to improve workflow. In practice, it meant junior staff, many of whom had never met the clients, were now representing the company. I was expected to support as needed. Then came the Munich fiasco. One of our oldest clients raised concerns about late deliverables and scope creep. The issue had been caused by Chad's team missing deadlines and misquoting timelines. Still, Brian called me into a Zoom meeting with HR and legal, hinting at a leadership accountability gap. He didn't accuse me outright, but the implication was clear. I left that call shaken, not because I was guilty, but because I finally saw what was happening. The setup wasn't sudden. It had been unfolding for months. My wife, Ava, had been warning me long before that. "This man doesn't like strong people around him," she said one night after I came home late and defeated. "He's not building a team, he's building a mirror." I waved it off, told her she was reading too much into things. I didn't want to believe that someone I had supported for years, whose vision I had championed to reluctant clients and skeptical partners, could be orchestrating my exit. But it was impossible to ignore now. In the weeks leading up to Florence, Brian grew more distant. His replies were curt. He began replying to client requests without looping me in, often contradicting strategies we had carefully developed together. And then the final insult: he declined to attend the Florence Forum himself, an event he had pushed me toward, citing schedule conflicts. In hindsight, it was strategic. With me out of the country, I couldn't defend myself, couldn't rally support internally, couldn't speak to clients before word of my firing spread. He didn't even wait for my speech to begin. He sent the termination email while I was backstage, just minutes before stepping out under the lights. He thought that firing me mid-event would break me. What he didn't realize was that it would expose him, because in that very audience sat a man he couldn't control, someone with more power than Brian had ever imagined. As the spotlight hit me and the applause rose in the auditorium, I walked to the podium with the weight of betrayal sitting like stone in my chest. My hands were steady, but inside I was unraveling. The words on that screen, "People like you are a liability," were still burning behind my eyes. I delivered the opening of my speech by memory, my voice calm, polished, even charismatic. But I wasn't present. Not really. I was standing there in a tailored suit, addressing a sea of executives, and all I could think about was how Brian Lockhart had gutted 7 years of my work in a single keystroke. But then, about 5 minutes into my talk, I saw him. Front row, center seat. I nearly missed it. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a watch more understated than expensive, a man I hadn't seen in 3 years sat with his fingers laced, his gaze fixed on me. Victor Kwan, executive chairman of KGI Holdings, the parent company that owned Catalyst Edge. Victor and I had met in Singapore back when I negotiated a multi-party expansion deal in Southeast Asia. I was still new then. Hungry, maybe a little. Reckless. And Victor had pulled me aside afterward and said, "You remind me of the version of myself before the politics set in. Don't lose that." We hadn't spoken since, but I remembered that moment like it was etched in stone. Now here, he was, watching me closely, and in that moment something shifted. I finished the speech with more force than I'd planned. I stopped relying on notes and started speaking from the pit of my stomach. Not about Catalyst Edge, not about the usual buzzwords. I spoke about loyalty, cultural understanding, and what happens when leaders confuse control with competence. I didn't name names, I didn't need to. I saw Victor raise an eyebrow once, then lean over to whisper something to the person beside him. When the session ended, the applause was louder than I expected. It rang hollow in my ears, until Victor stood and approached me directly. "Elijah," he said calmly, "you've grown." He gestured toward the lobby. "Walk with me." We strolled through the hallway, past sleek displays of corporate sponsorships, and espresso bars buzzing with executives. Only when we reached a quiet corner near the side exit did he speak again. "I saw your face at the start of that talk," he said. "You were shaken. Then I saw how you finished. Something happened. Didn't it?" I didn't hesitate. I handed him my phone open to the email Brian had sent. Victor read it twice, then turned the screen off slowly. "He didn't tell us," he said. "Not a word. Firing you wasn't discussed with the board and certainly not with me." Slipped the phone into my hand and met my eyes with a level gaze. "Walk me through what's been happening, everything." So I did. Right there, in a tucked-away alcove in a Florentine conference center, I laid out the slow unraveling. Chad's appointment, the erased credits, the redirected accounts, the Munich setup. Victor didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he nodded, once as if confirming something to himself. "I've been watching Brian for a while," he said. "He's good at growth, terrible at people. You, on the other hand, just delivered a speech I wish every CEO in our network had heard." He checked his watch. "I fly back to Hong Kong in the morning. You'll hear from me before the week is over." And just like that, he was gone. I flew back to New York the next day, still technically unemployed. But something inside me had changed. Brian had tried to exile me. What he had done instead was place me directly in the path of someone far more powerful and far more principled. And Victor Kwan wasn't the kind of man to let betrayal go unaddressed. The email came exactly 3 days later. The subject line was stark and unassuming. "Next steps." It was from Victor. Beneath it, a short message. "Let's talk today. 3 p.m., your time. Private line attached. Do not loop anyone else in." At 2:59 p.m., I was sitting at my dining room table staring at my laptop. A glass of water, a legal pad, and a copy of my non-compete agreement were laid out neatly beside me. The call connected on the first ring. Victor's voice was calm, almost casual, but there was an unmistakable undertone of purpose. "Elijah," he said, "we're moving quickly. You've earned that." He explained that after reviewing the circumstances around my termination and confirming with KGI's legal team that Brian had acted unilaterally, he had a proposal, a bold one. "I want you to come on board as Chief Transformation Officer for the entire KGI portfolio. Not just Catalyst Edge, all of it, Asia, Europe, North America. I want you to lead the next phase of integration across our global subsidiaries. But more importantly, he paused, you'll have complete authority over Catalyst Edge's operational direction, including personnel. It took me a full 10 seconds to absorb what he was saying. I wasn't just being offered a new job. I was being handed the exact structure Brian had tried to deny me, plus oversight over the company he still thought he controlled. There's just one condition, Victor said. I want this transition to be clean, quiet, professional, no retaliation, no gloating, just results. If Brian self-destructs, let it be on the strength of his decisions, not your anger. I agreed, not out of nobility, but because Victor was right. Revenge was satisfying in theory, but power, real, structural power, was sustainable. And now, I had it. That night, I contacted my lawyer and walked through every line of my non-compete clause. As suspected, it only applied to companies within a 200-mile radius of Catalyst Edge's Chicago headquarters. KGI Holdings was headquartered in Hong Kong, and I would technically be based out of their London office. Legally, Brian had no leash. Over the weekend, I got to work. I still had all my old contact lists, files, strategy briefs, nothing confidential, but a mountain of institutional memory stored legally on my personal devices. I began reaching out to key clients I had personally developed over the years. My emails were careful, respectful, and precise. I wanted to let you know that I've transitioned out of Catalyst Edge. I'll be continuing my work on international innovation through a new global initiative with KGI. If your team has questions, I'd be happy to connect. By Monday, the responses started rolling in. Curious, encouraging. Some were outright enthusiastic. 9 of the 11 clients I contacted agreed to introductory conversations. These weren't small accounts. These were anchor clients representing over $40 million in active contracts. Some had already expressed dissatisfaction with Chad. One German CIO wrote, "We've been deeply frustrated with the new point of contact. You were the reason we stayed loyal. Let's talk." Meanwhile, I received a curious email from a former colleague still inside Catalyst Edge. Subject line, FYI, your accounts are in chaos. The message included a forwarded client complaint thread about a botched rollout in Singapore, led by none other than Chad Morton. It got worse. The forwarded messages revealed that Chad had not only misunderstood basic implementation timelines, but he had also sent an internal memo, accidentally CCing the client, mocking their communication style as rigid and outdated. The moment I read it, I knew it was only a matter of time. I forwarded the entire thread to Victor with the subject, Unprompted Developments. He replied within minutes, "Let it play out." But I wasn't done. By Tuesday, I had assembled a proposal, a new global client relationship model, one that emphasized local cultural fluency, direct executive accountability, and an internal certification system for cross-market consulting. It was something I had pitched internally for years at Catalyst Edge, and had been dismissed for every time. Now Victor reviewed it personally. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "Let's make this your signature initiative. You'll present it to the board next week." In 6 days, I had gone from being fired to being handed the power to reshape the very industry that had tried to discard me. And the best part? Brian had no idea. He still thought he'd won. By the following Monday, cracks in Brian Lockhart's carefully curated empire began to show, and then spread like wildfire. The first real fracture came at 9:12 a.m., when a longtime client from Brussels, Avantech Solutions, formally requested a temporary pause on their engagement due to recent shifts in strategic alignment. That language was code. It meant, "We don't trust who you've put in charge anymore." Avantech represented a $6.2 million annual account. I hadn't even reached out to them yet. An hour later, Zenovia Biotech, one of our largest clients in the Asia-Pacific region, canceled a standing Q2 onboarding meeting. Chad, now flailing in the role of international director, tried to reconfirm via email. He received a terse response. "We prefer to wait until your internal leadership is clarified." Chad didn't know it yet, but that phrasing was directly from a memo I'd helped Zenovia's legal team craft a year earlier. By noon, 5 clients had either postponed meetings or ghosted entirely. That same afternoon, I received a discreet call from Tina Caldwell, Catalyst's senior director of HR. Tina had been one of the few people inside the company who always treated me with respect. Her voice was low, deliberate. "Elijah, you didn't hear this from me, but Brian's in full damage control. He thinks someone is sabotaging the client base, his words, not mine." "I'm not sabotaging anything," I said calmly. "I'm just not holding it together for him anymore." She exhaled audibly. "Well, he's unraveling and Chad's not helping." Chad, it seemed, had assumed that prestige and power were interchangeable. He didn't understand that these clients hadn't signed with Catalyst because of a glossy pitch deck or Brian's corporate posturing. They signed because of relationships, history, trust. And I was the human face of all of it. Later that day, Victor called. His voice was crisp, professional, but I could hear the faint edge of satisfaction underneath. "I've spoken to 3 of the clients you've already contacted. Every one of them praised your integrity and cultural intelligence. One of them actually said, 'We were only with Catalyst because of Elijah. Without him, the deal isn't worth the risk.' I assume you didn't ask them to say that." "I didn't," I replied. "But I'll admit it's gratifying to hear." Victor didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The evidence was piling up on its own. On Wednesday, Catalyst Edge received a legal notice from Lenosis Medical, formally requesting termination of their 2-year partnership agreement. This one wasn't subtle. The letter cited a loss of strategic, trust and executive misalignment. It was devastating. Lenosis had been Brian's most prized account. He had used it in nearly every investor pitch for the past year. That night, my phone rang. Brian. I let it go to voicemail. He left 3 messages. The first was defensive, the second was confused. The third sounded panicked. "Elijah, we need to talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We can work something out. Just call me back." I didn't. By Friday, the board at KGI was fully briefed. Victor had assembled a dossier that was as thorough as it was damning. Client exits, performance metrics post-termination, internal communications showing Chad's incompetence, and, most critically, a series of internal emails Brian had sent to the board, suggesting that I had voluntarily stepped away to explore other opportunities. That was the final nail. Victor forwarded those emails to me. I cross-referenced them with time-stamped evidence from Tina, proving I had been fired without warning. It was irrefutable. At noon, Brian was summoned to a closed-door session with the KGI board. I wasn't there, of course, but I knew how it went. The verdict came 2 hours later. Brian Lockhart was removed from his position as CEO of Catalyst Edge, effective immediately. Chad was reassigned to a non-client-facing role in special internal projects, which was corporate speak for exile. I received the news with an unexpected calm. There was no fist-pumping moment, no shouted victory, just a quiet sense of balance, being restored. That afternoon, I received another call from Tina. "You might want to know. Brian left the building without saying a word to anyone, packed up his office in 20 minutes. Security escorted him out." "Did he say where he was going?" She paused. "Not exactly, but I overheard him on the phone with someone. He said, 'I gave everything to this place and they still turned on me. He doesn't see what he did wrong.'" I nodded silently, even though she couldn't see me. That right there was the core of the problem. Brian had spent his career mistaking control for leadership. He thought he could treat people like disposable parts and still expect loyalty. What he never understood was that people don't follow titles. They follow character. The collapse wasn't loud. There was no front-page scandal or explosive press release. It was a quiet unraveling. Emails unreturned, meetings rescheduled. Indefinitely, revenue projections quietly adjusted downward. By the end of that quarter, Catalyst Edge had lost over $60 million in projected revenue and was forced to close its European office. And the man who thought firing me would eliminate a threat had instead triggered the single biggest internal exodus the company had ever seen. And I was only getting started. The following week, I flew to London. It wasn't a victory lap. It was orientation. My new role as Chief Transformation Officer of KGI Holdings officially began with a private board session in the company's Belgravia headquarters. The contrast was surreal. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had been terminated without warning, humiliated in silence. Now I was sitting at a polished oak table across from a dozen global executives. Not as a guest, but as an equal. Victor introduced me simply. This is Elijah Carter. He knows our clients better than most people know themselves. He's here to help us move forward, not just out of this disruption, but toward the kind of future we've talked about for years. There was no mention of Brian. No need. Everyone in that room understood why I was sitting there. Over the next 3 days, I met with leaders from KGI's divisions in Asia, Europe, and North America. We worked through integration plans, discussed cultural missteps, and reviewed client retention strategies. I was handed full authority to build a new operating framework for cross-border collaboration, one that corrected the very blind spots that Catalyst Edge had been ignoring for years. But the real shift wasn't structural. It was philosophical. For the first time in my career, I wasn't being asked to downplay my insights or defer to insecure executives. I was being asked to lead, not just in name, but in action. And that kind of trust, after years of suppression, was more powerful than any title. Meanwhile, Catalyst Edge began a slow, visible decline. Internally, morale plummeted. Chad had quietly resigned under the guise of pursuing other opportunities, though I later heard he was consulting for a small logistics firm in Indiana. The European office closure sent waves through the industry. Clients started asking tough questions, and competitors were circling like sharks. But KGI wasn't interested in revenge. We were focused on rebuilding. Correctly this time. Victor and I made an intentional decision. We would offer roles to several of the most competent, ethical people still left at Catalyst. Not to poach or retaliate, but to offer them what they'd never had, leadership that respected their potential. Tina Caldwell was the first to join us. I brought her on as Director of Global Talent Strategy, and she became one of the most effective people I've ever worked with. She didn't ask for credit, she just did the work. We also reclaimed clients, not with pressure, but with trust. I personally called each one, explained the transition, and let them decide. Most followed. Some didn't. That was fine. What mattered was that we had built something that no one could hijack or sabotage again. A year later, I stood once again in Florence. This time, not backstage, not under threat, but at the front of the auditorium, introduced by Victor himself as the opening keynote speaker for the forum I had once nearly missed entirely. The applause felt different, not louder, but deeper. This time it was for someone who had come back stronger, not bitter but better. My speech wasn't about revenge. It was about resilience. I spoke about the difference between authority and leadership, about how culture isn't defined by policies, but by who's allowed to thrive. I told the audience, when your value is tied only to what you produce, you're not part of a team. You're part of a machine. And machines break, but people adapt, evolve, and rebuild. Afterward, a young consultant approached me, nervous but sincere. She asked, "How did you not give up?" I smiled and told her the truth. I almost did, but then I realized, the worst thing someone can take from you is your belief in yourself. Once you get that back, they can't touch you. Today, KGI's new division, what we now call KGI Global Transformation, has tripled its client base, expanded into Latin America, and launched a mentorship program that I personally oversee. We've opened 2 new offices, one in Sao Paulo, another in Stockholm. Every policy, every hire, every cultural framework was built with one question in mind. Are we creating the kind of company we once needed but never had? That's the power shift no one saw coming. Not just a change in titles or reporting lines, but a change in purpose. Brian Lockhart's biggest mistake wasn't firing me. It was failing to understand the quiet force of people who have been underestimated too long, people who lead without a spotlight, People who know that success isn't handed out, it's earned and protected and shared. And now, it was mine to protect. From a leadership standpoint, this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a lesson in the quiet strength of emotional intelligence and the long game of integrity. Elijah didn't win because he outshouted his rivals. He won because he outlasted them. He stayed consistent in his values, respected relationships, and let competence, not ego, do the talking. In today's workplace, where titles often outpace substance and politics can drown out principle, stories like this remind us what real leadership looks like. It isn't loud, it isn't flashy, it's resilient, strategic, and deeply human. The truth is, the people we underestimate today may be the ones we work for tomorrow. And maybe that's the deeper message. You can't bury someone who's already rooted in purpose. If you've ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or quietly betrayed, what would you have done in Elijah's place? Let me know in the comments. Your thoughts, your stories, or even just a moment when you realized you were stronger than they thought. I read every one, and if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, consider liking or sharing. It helps us bring more stories like this to light. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply becoming undeniable.